It was 4 a.m. when she showed up at my door. My daughter, Josephine, barely standing, bloodshot eyes, her face swollen from bruises that didn't belong on a woman I used to see in the mirror. And there was no one else to blame but Cecil, that damn coward, the man who'd sworn to protect her, who promised to love her until death do them part, had just thrown her out like trash. His twisted little games had gone too far this time, but he had no idea what he'd just unleashed. He thought he could get away with it, with humiliating her, breaking her down, thinking he'd just walk away unscathed. But that's when it hit me. I was done being a spectator. I wasn't just her father anymore. I was the one who was going to make him pay. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. I knew I should have seen the signs earlier. The way he'd look at her at family gatherings, like she was his property. But I turned a blind eye, just like I always did when the little things didn't seem so little. Maybe I thought she could handle it on her own. But this? No, not this. Not while she was standing there, blood on her hands and tears in her eyes, looking at me like I was the only one who could fix it. And that's when I made my decision. I put on my old uniform, grabbed the phone, and dialed up my old partner, Baxter. I wasn't just going to let this go. Cecil had crossed a line, and now he'd face the consequences. He had no idea what was coming for him. I can still remember the cold metal feel of the phone in my hand. It hadn't been used for anything serious in years. Hell, I was retired. I'd traded my badge for a quiet life, fishing on weekends and watching old reruns of The Twilight Zone. But not tonight. Not after seeing my daughter broken and trembling in front of me. No, this wasn't some routine case. This was personal. This was my family. And Cecil was going to learn the hard way that you don't mess with my own. Baxter, it's Dorian. We've got a situation. The words came out more steady than I expected. But inside, I was a goddamn storm. I wasn't the same guy I used to be, the one who took orders and followed the rules. No, tonight I was the law. And the law had no mercy for people like Cecil. Baxter didn't even hesitate. You need me to come by? Got your back. D, whatever it takes. I felt a flicker or something. Gratitude. Maybe. It had been years since I'd called him for anything. And that's when it really hit me. I wasn't alone in this. I had people who still remembered who I was, who still respected me. I wasn't just some old man in a recliner watching the world pass by. I was a goddamn force. After I hung up, I looked over at Josephine. She was sitting there, staring at the floor, her hands twisted in her lap. It hurt me to see her like this. I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, thick like molten lava, but I forced myself to calm down. I couldn't let the rage control me. Not yet. I had to think this through. You're not going to have to deal with him anymore. I told her, my voice steady. I promise you that. But even as I said it, a part of me knew this wasn't just about protecting her anymore. It was about redemption, about fixing the one mistake I'd made all those years ago. The mistake of letting her down, of not seeing the warning signs. I wasn't going to make that mistake again. Not this time. The plan was simple. We'd get him. The right way. The only way. And Cecil? He'd never see it coming. I didn't expect it to feel so heavy. The uniform. It had been hanging in the back of my closet for years, gathering dust. I hadn't worn it since the day I retired. The day I told myself I was done with that life. But now, it felt like a second skin, like the old Dorian was coming back. And I'll tell you, that man wasn't gentle. He didn't ask for permission. He made things happen. I stood there for a second, looking at myself in the mirror. The wrinkles on my face didn't lie. I was older now, no doubt about it. But in that moment, I didn't feel like a tired old man. I felt sharp, focused, like the fire inside me had never gone out, just simmered under the surface, waiting for the right moment. And that moment was now. I could feel Josephine watching me from the doorway, her eyes wide, uncertain. She hadn't said a word since I made the call to Baxter, but I knew she was scared. Scared for herself, scared for me. And honestly, I didn't blame her. What father in their right mind would want to drag their daughter through something like this? But I knew there was no other way. You ready? I asked, zipping up the jacket. My voice wasn't as steady as I wanted it to be, but I pushed it aside. She nodded slowly, looking like she wanted to believe me, but wasn't sure she could. I couldn't blame her for that, either. But I wasn't about to back out now. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about me fixing my past mistakes. We left the house quietly, Josephine clutching her purse to her chest like it was her only shield. And I couldn't blame her for that, either. But as we stepped out into the cold morning air, I felt a shift inside me, a feeling that I hadn't had in years. It was like I was waking up from a long sleep, shaking off the rust, and becoming someone I hadn't been in a long time, a man with purpose. Baxter met us at the car, his usual grim expression plastered on his face. He didn't say much, just gave me a nod. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it meant the world. We were a team again. We got in the car, and I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had one focus now, Cecil. And I wasn't about to let him get away with what he'd done. As we pulled away, I glanced over at Josephine. Her face was still pale, but there was something else there now, something that hadn't been there before. Hope. Maybe, just maybe I could give her that. But I had to make sure Cecil never forgot this day. The house was quiet when we pulled up, too quiet. The lights were off, and for a moment, I wondered if maybe Cecil had caught wind of what was coming. But no, he was the type who thought he was untouchable. A small-time bully with too much ego and not enough brains. I could already hear his voice in my head, that condescending tone he'd used to talk down to anyone who didn't buy into his nonsense. We parked a few houses down, trying to keep a low profile. Baxter and I shared a look. Both of us knew how this was going to go. Josephine stayed in the car, her hands clenched in her lap, her gaze glued to the house. She didn't want to be here, and I didn't blame her, but she wasn't going to back out now. We going fast. We don't give him a chance to run, I said, already feeling the adrenaline pumping through me. This wasn't going to be some quiet, civil arrest. This was going to be loud, messy, and it was going to make a statement. We approached the door, and I knocked hard enough to shake the frame. I could hear movement inside, footsteps, muffled voices. And then the door cracked open, just enough for Cecil to peer out with his cocky grin, like he had no idea what was about to hit him. "Can I help you, officer?" His voice was smug, as if he thought this was some kind of joke. "Open the door, Cecil," I said, my voice low and controlled. "We're here to talk." He froze for a second, his smile faltering. But then, just as I expected, he opened it wider, trying to put on that bravado like he always did. "You think you're tough, huh?" he sneered, looking me up and down. "What? You come to arrest me for what? Because your daughter's a little unstable? She can't handle a marriage?" I didn't flinch. "Not this time. Not anymore. We're arresting you for assault, for battery, for everything you've done to her," I said, stepping forward with Baxter at my side. Cecil's face drained the color. His cocky expression was replaced with something I hadn't seen before. Fear. "That's right," Baxter chimed in, his voice cold. "You're done, Cecil." Before he could react, we moved in. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists with finality that made my chest tighten. He tried to fight back, stumbling backward, but it was useless. This time, he wasn't in control. As we dragged him out the car, I saw Josephine's face through the window. She was watching. Her eyes were wide, but there was something else there now. It wasn't fear. It was something like relief. I didn't look at Cecil as we shoved him into the back of the squad car. He wasn't worth the energy. I just turned to Baxter and nodded. "Let's take him to where he belongs." And with that, we drove off, leaving Cecil behind. But this time, he was the one who had nowhere to run. The courtroom was a cold place, the kind of place I hadn't been in years. But as I sat there, watching Cecil shift uncomfortably in the defendant's chair, I could feel the weight of everything building inside me. His lawyer, slick, smooth-talking, was trying to paint Josephine as unstable, as if her bruises were just some tragic accident. And Cecil? Well, he sat there like he didn't have a care in the world, smiling and nodding at his defense team like the whole thing was a game. But I knew better. I'd seen it before, the lies, the manipulation, the gaslighting. This wasn't just a man who hurt his wife. This was a man who thought he could get away with anything. Josephine was on the stand now. She looked so small, so fragile up there, but I could see it, the strength in her eyes, the way she gripped the railing like it was the only thing keeping her from breaking. She told her story calm and steady, like she was reading from a script, but her words cut through that courtroom like a knife. I didn't think he'd ever do this, she said, her voice shaking. I thought maybe he'd change. But it kept getting worse. The anger, the control, the way he'd isolate me from my friends, my family. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was trapped. Cecil sat there, his eyes darting around, unable to meet her gaze. His smugness was gone now, replaced with that panic I'd seen before when things didn't go his way. As the trial went on, the evidence mounted. The photos, the medical records, the testimonies. Everything lined up, but it wasn't until Ingrid took the stand that things really started to crumble for him. Ingrid, the woman he thought could be his escape. She told everything about the affair, about the abuse, about how Cecil had threatened her when she tried to break it off. She was terrified of him, just like Josephine had been. And the look on Cecil's face when she spoke was priceless. He knew it was over. By the end of the day, the jury didn't need more convincing. The case was as solid as it could get. As we left the courtroom, I could see Josephine standing taller. Her eyes were brighter, more confident. She wasn't the broken girl I'd found that night anymore. She was a woman who had fought for herself, and she'd won. I glanced at her, my heart swelling with pride. I'd kept my promise. But in the back of my mind, I knew this was just the beginning. The day the verdict came down, I barely slept. I sat in my old recliner, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything that had happened since Josephine had knocked on my door that night. The bruises, the fear in her eyes. Cecil's smug attitude as if he were untouchable. All of it had led to this moment. But even then, I wasn't sure if justice was going to be served. Josephine had handled herself with more grace than I could ever have imagined. The whole trial, she'd stood strong, speaking her truth with a calm that I hadn't expected. But beneath the surface, I knew she was just as scared as I was. We were up against a man who thought he was above it all. The system was supposed to protect us, but you never really knew if it would until the gavel came down. The waiting was the hardest part. The court was tense, and I could feel the pressure in my chest every time the door opened. But then, at last, the bailiff stood, signaling the judge to come in. The room fell silent. Cecil sat there, as arrogant as ever, his lawyer whispering in his ear, but I could see the cracks. He was sweating now, his palms jittering. He could feel the walls closing in. It wasn't over for him yet, and he knew it. Will the defendant please rise? The judge's voice cut through the silence, and Cecil stood with a small, defiant glare in my direction. I didn't flinch. This wasn't about him. This was about Josephine. The judge turned to the jury, nodding for them to announce the verdict. My stomach twisted into knots as I waited. It felt like an eternity, but the words finally came. We, the jury, find the defendant, Cecil Montgomery, guilty of assault and battery, and guilty of coercion and harassment. It was a slow burn. It hit me first like a shock to the chest, the sound of the word guilty echoing in my ears. I wanted to jump up, to scream, but I didn't. I had to let Josephine have this moment. Cecil's face went pale. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked like a man who just realized he wasn't as invincible as he thought. His lawyer's face twisted in disbelief, but no amount of legal maneuvering could save him now. The judge continued. You are sentenced to 18 months of probation, mandatory anger management courses, and a restraining order from the victim. It wasn't prison, but it was something. It was more than I had expected, more than I dared to hope for. Josephine looked at me then, her face a mix of relief and disbelief. The weight she'd carried for so long was lifting, piece by piece. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, but this time they weren't from pain. They were from a release I knew she needed, and I had helped give her. Cecil turned to leave, but his eyes darted toward us one last time. His defiant stare was gone, replaced with something desperate, something broken. I almost felt sorry for him, but then I remembered who he was, what he had done. And I didn't. Josephine was free, and I would make damn sure that freedom wasn't taken away from her again. We walked out of the courthouse together, father and daughter. She didn't need to say a word. Her smile, the way she stood taller with every step, said it all. The battle wasn't over, but it felt damn good to win this round. The divorce papers came in the mail a few weeks after the verdict. The finality of it hit harder than I thought it would. I knew it was coming, of course. Hell, I've been expecting it since the first time I saw Cecil's hands on Josephine. But there was something about seeing it in black and white that made it all too real. Josephine sat at the kitchen table, the papers spread out in front of her. Her fingers lightly touched the edge of the document like it was fragile, as if it could crumble in her hands if she wasn't careful. The weight of the moment was heavy, but I could see the way her shoulders had relaxed since the trial. There was a new confidence in her, something I hadn't seen in years. "You sure about this?" I asked, standing in the doorway. I didn't need to ask. Not really. She'd made her mind up long before, but I had to hear it from her. She looked up at me, a small smile on her lips. "I'm sure, Dad. I'm finally free." It wasn't just the papers. It wasn't just the end of the marriage. It was the end of everything that had held her back. The manipulation, the fear, the lies. All of it was gone now. "I think it's time," she said, her voice a little steadier now. She grabbed the pen, hesitating for a moment, and then signed. Just like that, she was done with Cecil. I watched her sign her name, and a part of me felt proud. Proud of how far she'd come. Proud of how she stood up for herself when the whole world was stacked against her. But another part of me felt something else. Something protective, like I still needed to keep an eye on her, to make sure she never had to face this kind of darkness again. Once she finished, she looked up at me. "I'm changing my name, Dad. I need to. It's the last thing I can do to let go." I nodded. It made sense. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a complete break from everything that had tried to define her. The name, the house, the life she'd built with Cecil. All of it was part of a past she needed to leave behind. She held up the pen, smiling as if she'd just won a battle. And maybe, in a way, she had. "The kids are going to be okay, right?" I asked, sitting down next to her. She nodded, her expression softening. "Yeah, Harlow's already asking when we can go on another trip. And Giselle, she's still adjusting, but she's strong. Just like her mom." I felt a lump in my throat. It wasn't just relief I was feeling now. It was hope. Hope for her future. For their future. But as I looked at those divorce papers again, my mind drifted back to Cecil. The man who had done this to her. The man who had thought he could control her. I didn't know if he'd ever understand the cost of what he'd done. But I knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to be a part of her life anymore. Not in any way that mattered. The last thing I heard as we walked out of the house was the sound of Josephine's laugh. It wasn't forced or nervous. It was real. It was a sound that hadn't existed in this house for far too long. And as we shut the door behind us, I knew that things were finally different, that this was the beginning of something new for her. No more fear, no more pain, just freedom. The days after the divorce felt like a blur. Josephine started settling into her new life, and I could see the weight slowly lifting off her shoulders. It wasn't a complete turnaround, not yet, but she was trying, and that was everything. I could tell by the way she held her head higher, the way she started taking those first tentative steps back into the world. We were at a park a few weeks later, watching Harlow and Giselle play in the sandbox. They were laughing, completely unaware of the storm that had just passed through their lives. I couldn't help but think back to when they first came to live with us, after everything had gone down with Cecil. The trauma in their eyes, the fear that clouded their small faces. But now, they were just kids again. And Josephine? She was starting to smile like she hadn't in years. "I don't know what I would have done without you, Dad," Josephine said, her voice soft, but full of gratitude. She was sitting beside me on the park bench, her legs crossed, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at me with a kind of tenderness I hadn't seen in a long time. "You saved me." I didn't know what to say to that. I hadn't done it for a thank you. I did it because she was my daughter, and there was no other choice. But hearing her say it, seeing the sincerity in her eyes, I couldn't deny it. Maybe I had saved her, but it was her own strength that pulled her through. You did the hard part, kiddo, I said, nudging her with my elbow. You're the one who fought through it. I just made sure you had someone in your corner. She smiled, but there was something different about it this time. It wasn't the sad, forced smile I used to see when she was trapped in that marriage. This one was real. And then, just like that, I saw it. The future. Her future. A future where she was in control, not him. Where she could make decisions for herself, without fearing the consequences of someone else's anger. It was a simple thought, but it gave me a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. But there was still a part of me that was watching, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Because despite all the progress, despite all the victories, I knew Cecil wasn't done. And I knew that one day, he'd try to come back into her life, even if it was just to try to hurt her one more time. I turned to Josephine, meeting her eyes. Don't forget, kid, we're not finished here. She nodded slowly, a glimmer of understanding passing between us. But that was a thought for another day. For now, I could just breathe. For now, we could enjoy a rare moment of peace. And as the kids ran back to us, their laughter ringing out, I finally allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. I knew it wasn't over. Even though things had settled down for Josephine, even though she seemed to be putting the pieces of her life back together, I had that gut feeling. The kind of feeling that told you the storm wasn't truly gone, just waited to flare back up, and I wasn't wrong. It came one evening, about 2 months after the divorce had been finalized. I was in the garage, fixing the old lawnmower, something simple to keep my mind busy. Josephine had just finished dinner, and the kids were playing in the living room, their laughter a welcome sound after all we'd been through. But then the phone rang. It wasn't a number I recognized, but I could hear the edge in the voice on the other end. Dorian, it's Cecil. I froze. The sound of his name made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. For a moment, I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My mind was still processing the fact that this man, this coward, was calling me. He had no right to be a part of Josephine's life, let alone mine. What do you want, Cecil? My voice was steady, but underneath, I could feel the simmering anger. Listen, I know things didn't go down the way I planned, he said, his voice full of false sincerity. But I want to talk. About the kids. About us, you know? I've changed. I want to make things right. I laughed, though there was no humor in it. You want to make things right? After everything you've done? There was a pause on the other end. And for a moment, I thought maybe he realized the gravity of his actions. But then his voice came again, this time colder. I'm just trying to be civil here, Dorian. I'm asking for a chance to be in their lives again. That was it. I felt my blood boil. Every word, every phrase, every lie he tried to twist. It was all too much. No, Cecil, you don't get to come back. Not after what you did. My voice was ice. You're done. He didn't respond right away, and I could almost hear him fuming on the other side of the line. Finally, he spoke, the words laced with venom. You'll regret this, Dorian. You have no idea who you're messing with. I didn't even flinch. I'd heard his threats before. But this time, they meant nothing. I'm not afraid of you anymore, I said and hung up. It was over. But I knew he wouldn't let it go. Not without a fight. I just didn't know yet how far he'd go. But one thing was clear. This was far from the end of the story. It wasn't long before I felt the tension building again. The phone call from Cecil had been a warning, but it wasn't enough to prepare me for what happened next. It was just after dinner when I first noticed something off. Josephine was in the kitchen, cleaning up, her movements slow and tired. The kids were in bed, the house quiet, a rare moment of peace. I was sitting in the living room, going through some old papers, when I heard a car pull up outside. I glanced out the window, but the headlights were too bright to make out the car's details. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was a neighbor. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of boots crunching on gravel, someone walking toward the house. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the first time I'd felt this way, this sudden sense of something wrong. My instincts were screaming, and I wasn't about to ignore them. I quietly walked over to the front door and peeked through the blinds. That's when I saw him, Cecil, standing at the end of the driveway, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, his expression unreadable. He wasn't there to talk. He was there to intimidate. I moved quickly, my mind racing. I didn't want to scare Josephine, but I needed to make sure she was safe. I grabbed my phone and texted her, "Stay inside. Lock the door. Don't come out." I could hear her footsteps from the kitchen, and I didn't want to alarm her more than necessary, but I had to get to her before he did. I grabbed my old service revolver from the drawer, the weight of it familiar in my hand, and moved to the door. Just as I was about to open it, I heard Cecil's voice, low and mocking, cutting through the silence. "You really think you can protect her, Dorian? You think I'm just going to walk away after all this?" I froze. "You've made a mistake," he said, his words dripping with malice. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." My blood ran cold, but I didn't let it show. I knew he was trying to provoke me. I wasn't going to let him have that power over me. Not anymore. I stepped back, waiting, and then the sound of his boots faded into the night, the crunch of gravel slowly dying as he retreated. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest. He hadn't come for a casual conversation. He wasn't done yet. Josephine came to the door then, her face full of concern. "Dad, what's going on?" I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Nothing you need to worry about. Just a visit from an old friend." But deep down I knew Cecil wasn't going to stop. Not until he got what he thought he deserved. And I was going to have to be ready. I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed up, watching the driveway from the window, listening for any sign of Cecil's return. Every little sound seemed amplified. The rustling of the trees, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint were the streetlights flickering outside. But the most persistent sound was the beating of my own heart, hammering in my chest like a countdown to something I couldn't quite prepare for. Josephine tried to act normal the next morning, putting on a smile as she made breakfast for the kids. But I could see it in her eyes. She knew something wasn't right. She had that same tightness around her jaw, that little flicker of fear she couldn't hide. I hated seeing it, but I couldn't protect her from everything. "Dad." Her voice was soft as she stood in the doorway to the kitchen. "What happened last night? Is he gone?" I set my mug down, careful not to make any sudden movements. I didn't want to make her more scared than she already was. "He left. For now." She didn't seem convinced. Neither was I. The hours dragged on, and just when I thought maybe, just maybe, things would calm down, my phone rang. I didn't even need to look at the caller ID. I knew who it was. Cecil. I hesitated for a second before answering. When I did, his voice hit me like a slap to the face. "You're still playing the hero, huh?" He spat, the malice dripping from his words. "You think you can control everything, Dorian? You can't keep me away from my kids forever. You know that, right?" I kept my voice steady, even as the anger surged through me. "You've lost your chance, Cecil. You'll never be a part of their lives again." There was a pause, and then the sound of a low, mocking laugh on the other end. "We'll see about that. You've made a big mistake, Dorian. Don't think you can protect them forever." And with that, he hung up. I sat there, the phone still in my hand, staring at the screen, as if I could will some sense into it. But I knew better. Cecil wasn't the kind of man who would back down. He wasn't the type to accept defeat, not when his pride was on the line. Josephine came up behind me, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. What did he say? I didn't meet her eyes. "He's not done, Joe. He's not going to stop until he gets what he wants." And that's when I knew. This wasn't just about protecting her anymore. This was about making sure he paid for what he'd done. No more games. No more threats. It was time to end this. The tension in the air was thick. I could feel it in every corner of the house, every word Josephine spoke, and every glance she threw my way. Things were slipping back into that uncomfortable rhythm, the one where we were always looking over our shoulders, waiting for the next move. Cecil had made his threats, and I knew from experience that he didn't make idle promises. He was dangerous, unpredictable, and now his words were starting to feel like a countdown, a ticking clock. I spent the next few days more on edge than ever. I installed a few more security cameras around the house, checked the locks more than once, and kept a closer eye on the kids. Josephine noticed, of course. She'd raise an eyebrow when I set the alarm for the third time that night, but she didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. We were both living in the same unspoken fear, a fear that had taken root the moment Cecil had walked back into our lives. Then came the moment I should have seen coming, the one that made the pieces click into place. It was a Tuesday, nothing unusual, just another quiet evening. Josephine was out running errands, and I had the kids at home. I was going over some old files in the study when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the last thing I wanted was a distraction. But as soon as I stood up, something in my gut told me this was no coincidence. I walked toward the door, peering through the peephole. I didn't recognize the man standing on the other side, but I knew that face. I knew that look. He had that familiar look of someone who thought he could intimidate his way through life. Another of Cecil's cronies. It was clear that he wasn't there for friendly chit-chat. I opened the door slowly, just enough to keep a bit of distance between us. "Can I help you?" He grinned, that same cocky grin I'd seen on Cecil's face too many times to count. "I'm just here to deliver a message, old man." I froze. My mind raced, but I kept my voice calm. "What message?" He leaned in, his breath stinking of cigarettes, and whispered, "Tell Cecil I'm not the only one who's coming for you." He stepped back, a cruel laugh escaping his lips as he turned and walked off without another word. The door slammed shut behind me, and for a moment I was paralyzed. I knew exactly what this was. It wasn't a warning. It was a sign that things were escalating faster than I could control. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my phone and called Baxter. He picked up on the first ring. "Dorian." His voice was alert, ready. "Cecil's sending people now." I said, my voice tight. "It's not just him anymore. He's putting pressure on me. On us." Baxter didn't hesitate. "We're going to get ahead of this, Dorian. Don't do anything stupid. We'll take care of it." I could hear his voice, steady and reassuring, but deep down, I knew I had to take control of the situation myself. It was no longer just about protecting Josephine. Now it was about keeping this monster away for good. I glanced at the clock. Time was running out. I didn't waste any more time. The moment I hung up with Baxter, my mind was already racing, calculating every possible angle. I knew Cecil wouldn't stop, not after the way things had played out. And now, with his goons involved, it was clear he had nothing left to lose. I checked the security footage from the cameras outside. The guy who had shown up at the door was on film. Average height, dark jacket, unremarkable. But his face, that look in his eyes, was something I'd never forget. He wasn't just a messenger. He was a reminder that I was in deep now, deeper than I'd thought. I wasn't going to let this go any further. I knew that if I sat around waiting for the authorities to step in, it could be too late. Baxter had my back, but I needed to make sure we were one step ahead. I wasn't going to let Cecil pull the strings anymore. It was time to take matters into my own hands. Josephine walked into the room just as I was grabbing my jacket. I could tell she had that worried look on her face, the one that had become all too familiar over the past few months. "Where are you going?" she asked, trying to mask her concern. "Out," I said, my voice sharp and controlled. "I'm not sitting around waiting for Cecil's next move. I'll be back in a couple of hours." She didn't argue. She didn't have to. She knew me well enough by now to know when I was done talking. But I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the fear she was trying to hide behind her stoic expression. "I don't want you to do anything reckless, Dad," she said quietly, her voice trembling just slightly. "Please." I met her gaze, my expression softening. "I'm not doing anything reckless, Joe. I'm just taking control. You've been through enough. Now it's my turn to fix this, once and for all." She nodded, though I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. But I didn't have time to convince her now. I had to handle this before it spiraled further. I stepped outside, the cool night air biting at my skin. I drove to a few places, some old connections, people I hadn't spoken to in years. I needed information, something to track Cecil's movements. I wasn't going to wait for him to make his next move. I was going to make mine first. The night dragged on, but eventually I found the lead I was looking for. A small, private club on the edge of town. A place where people like Cecil like to hide. I'd been there before, years ago, during my time on the force. It was a good place to start. I texted Baxter on my way there. I've got a lead. Meet me at the old club. The plan was simple. Gather information, get eyes on Cecil, and make sure his next move was his last. I wasn't just going to let him threaten my family anymore. As I pulled into the club's parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The club was just as I remembered it, dark, gritty, and full of people who had something to hide. It wasn't a place you went for a night of fun. It was where you went when you needed to disappear, to blend into the shadows. I'd walked through those doors plenty of times before, back when I was still working, but now it felt different. I wasn't here for business, as usual. This time, I was here to make sure Cecil didn't get away with it. I parked the car a few spots down, keeping a low profile. The last thing I wanted was to walk in there with a target on my back. I texted Baxter again. Stay on standby. I'll call you if anything goes south. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, my mind sharp and focused. I could already hear the muffled bass from the club speakers, the kind of thumping sound that made your chest vibrate. But this wasn't about music. This was about tracking down a man who thought he could walk away from everything he'd done. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, the faint smell of alcohol, and cheap cologne hanging in the air. The lights were dim, casting long shadows over the worn-out furniture. People were scattered around, talking in low voices, their eyes shifting, avoiding direct contact. This wasn't a place for normal folk. This was where the desperate came to forget, and where the dangerous came to regroup. I walked past the bar, scanning the faces in the crowd. My eyes flicked over every person, searching for someone who looked like they had a connection to Cecil. And then there he was, a guy sitting in the back corner booth, wearing a leather jacket that looked way too expensive for this place. His face was familiar, but I couldn't place him at first. He was talking to someone, his hands gesturing wildly, trying to make a point. But it wasn't his words that caught my attention. It was the look on his face. The same look Cecil had worn the last time I'd seen him. Defiant, like he didn't think anything could touch him. I didn't approach right away. I kept my distance, hanging by the edge of the bar. I had to be careful. The last thing I needed was to spook this guy and have him run off without saying a word. Then, as if fate had a sense of irony, he turned and caught my eye. For a split second, we locked gazes. I could see the recognition in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by something else, fear. He stood up, hurriedly muttering something to the person next to him. I didn't hesitate. I moved fast, heading straight for the booth. "Hey," I said, my voice low but firm. "We need to talk." He froze, his body stiffening, eyes darting around like he was looking for an escape route. But there was no way out of this. Not anymore. You've got one chance to make this easy. I added, my tone colder this time. Tell me where Cecil is. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. I could feel it, and I could tell he could, too. The ball was in his court now, and the way things were going, he knew it. The man didn't move for a moment, his eyes shifting from side to side, looking for a way out. But there was no easy way out for him now. I wasn't going to let him walk away. Not after everything that had happened. Not after what Cecil had put my daughter through. He swallowed hard, his fingers twitching slightly, like he was debating whether or not to bolt. I stepped forward, closer, keeping my voice low but forceful. "You're going to tell me where Cecil is, and you're going to do it now, or things are going to get real ugly." His eyes flickered to the door, the thought of running obvious in his mind. But then he seemed to deflate, realizing there was nowhere to run. The fear hit him hard, like a weight pressing down on his chest. He knew I wasn't playing games. "Cecil's not here," he said, his voice shaky. "He's hiding out. I don't know where exactly, but I know who he's been talking to." That caught my attention. "Who?" I asked, Leaning in closer, my hand instinctively resting on the edge of the table. The guy hesitated, then glanced around nervously. The sound of music and muffled voices from the crowd faded into the background, leaving just the two of us in the dim corner. There's a guy, real shady character, always keeps a low profile. He runs a lot of Cecil's. Side business. He's been keeping him hidden. Not far from here. A warehouse, over on the east side of town. I let the information sink in, processing it quickly. A warehouse. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and it was closer than I thought. We're exactly on the east side. I pressed, my patience running thin. He swallowed again. On Vine Street, near the old docks. It's abandoned, but that's where they've been meeting. That's all I know, I swear. I nodded slowly, taking in everything he said. Vine Street, the old docks. I had no doubt now that Cecil was getting desperate. He was making moves, trying to get away from the consequences, but he was running out of options. I reached into my jacket, pulling out a wad of cash. I tossed it onto the table. This is for your trouble. Don't make the mistake of crossing me again. He looked at the money but didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, he looked me in the eye, his face pale with fear. You've got no idea what you're getting into, man. Cecil's not going to let you walk away from this. He'll come for you and everyone you care about. I leaned in, my voice cold. I'm not afraid of him. And when this is over, you'll have no one left to run to. You'd be smart to stay out of it from here on out. The man nodded quickly, not wanting to provoke me further. I turned and walked away, not bothering to look back. As I stepped out into night air, I felt the weight of what I was about to do settling heavily in my chest. But there was no turning back now. The final confrontation was coming, and Cecil had no idea what was waiting for him. Vine Street, the warehouse. I would find him there, and I would make sure he never hurt my daughter again. He thought he could come back and walk through my life like it was his backyard barbecue. He thought he could scare my family, intimidate my daughter, and get away with it. He had no idea what was coming. That line still rattled in my chest as I stepped out of the car onto Vine Street, my old jacket heavy across my shoulders like an armor-plated memory. The warehouse smelled of oil and stale beer. Lights cut through the gloom. A pair of flashbulbs from a reporter's camera, a drone buzzing above, and a low murmur of men who'd been paid to do dirty work. Baxter and Abel flanked me, their faces set. Inside, Cecil lounged like a king in a ruined throne room, cuffing himself to a bottle and laughing. He figured this would be a show for his people, not a reckoning. I walked up to him the way I used to walk into rooms that needed order. No heroics, no swagger, just a steady, old man's calm. I pulled out the folded divorce papers, Josephine's new name scrawled across the top, and unfolded the photo of her wedding. The one Cecil had tried to claim was his. The denim-threaded edge of my uniform brushed my knuckles. It had been a mirror at the beginning, and now it was a blade. You ruined a family, I said, quiet enough that only he could hear the contempt. The warehouse went still, the men's bravado cracking like old paint. I reached into my pocket and let the cuffs fall into my palm. Real ones, not the show cuffs he expected. Baxter had called it in. A team waited outside. This was the moment the city would see him without his mask. I snapped him on his wrist myself. The click echoed, a sound I'd heard 1,000 times in life of arrests, but never with this sweetness. Cameras found us. Lights burned his face into grainy pixels, and his laugh turned brittle. Men who'd followed him stepped back. Ingrid, who'd once hidden in shadow, stepped forward and spat his name into a mic. The live feed lit up phones across town. 3 humiliations stacked. The house arrest, the courtroom, and now this. The man who'd hurt my daughter paraded in public as everyone watched him finally lose his grip. I held his gaze, and for the first time since that 4 a.m. knock, I let something close to mercy slip through. Not forgiveness. That's between him and whatever's left of his conscience. But a finishing. Josephine's kids played in the distance, their laughter a clean note slicing the warehouse static. I handed the wedding photo back to the daughter of the man he destroyed, now whole in her new name, and watched her tuck it into her pocket, like reclaiming a life. When they led him away, the crowd's whispers followed him like a chorus. He tried to shout, to threaten thin, impotent things. The uniform on my back felt lighter. I unbuttoned the jacket, folded it, and placed it on the hood of the squad car, the same fabric that had been a burden and then a shield. I pressed it into Josephine's hands. "Keep it," I said, "so you always know who stood with you." She didn't cry. She only smiled, small, fierce, like sunlight after a storm. Baxter clapped me on the shoulder. Abel radioed the precinct. Probation violation, intimidation, conspiracy, paperwork that would keep him locked in the court of public shame for good. As we walked away, the drone's last buzz faded and the click of the cuffs became music, a closing chord. I'd spent 35 years answering calls, patching holes, bearing the weight of things left unsaid. Tonight, I'd made one right. Tonight, the man who taught my daughter fear learned what fear felt like back, and as the city light swallowed the warehouse behind us, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not revenge in a cheap sense, but kind of clean that comes after you scrub a stain until rag tears. I had given her back her name, her children, her laughter. I had given myself back the thing I thought I'd lost, the proof that a man can change the shape of a life one decisive night at a time. He'll remember this night forever, not because he served time, but because I made sure he heard the sound that ends every good story. The final click. If you like this story, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the right.